Michael Kugalman, thanks very much for taking out the time for people watching the broadcast. Michael Kugalman is the South Asia Institute Director at the Wilson Center. Michael, what is this visit about? What are we trying to achieve here?
Well, first and foremost, it's about underscoring the importance of partnership. We've all heard so much that this is a relatively rare occurrence, that the U.S. has so many partners, so many allies, and many of them don't receive the honor of a state visit. So this is, of course, only the third state visit that any Indian leader will have experienced. So I think that objective of highlighting just how significant this partnership is, that's a factor right there. And I think it also speaks to President Biden's own personal support for the idea of deep partnership with India. If you look at what he's said and written, going back to his days as a senator and then when he was vice president, he's always been a big proponent of partnership. So I think that this visit certainly has his imprimatur, or will have his imprimatur on it as well. Beyond that, I mean, there's a lot of objectives with this visit, and I think that we've already heard from your conversation with Rick that there's so much on the table, and it's not just defense. I think that all the talk about the likelihood of a deal on drones and the GE jet engine deal, that's gotten a lot of attention, but it's important to emphasize that this has become a very multifaceted relationship, and there's an expectation of new agreements on everything from the announcement of new U.S. consulates in India to Micron perhaps committing to something that will allow India to strengthen its capacity to produce semiconductors. There's a lot on the table, and I think that's another objective of the state visit, not just to underscore the importance of the U.S.-India partnership, but also to showcase just how much it's grown on so many levels in relatively little time.
So what is the perception of how we've grown? Because we look at the headline numbers, $3.7 trillion. We're told that, okay, fifth largest, soon to be fourth largest. You should sometime, the next year be overtaking Germany, maybe even pushing to be third largest in the next 18 to 2 years. But those are figures. In terms of perception, is India still considered as a backwater, as a market, or as a place for serious development and R&D?
No, it's definitely not perceived as a backwater. I would argue that for all the talk about defense cooperation, economic and commercial cooperation has quietly become a major success story in this relationship. Even though you have a number of tensions on the trade side, which got worse during the Trump administration, haven't yet been worked out. But you look back to when this relationship really started to make some major strides in the early 1990s. It was really driven by trade and economic partnership following India's economic liberalization reforms back then. And that's continued up to now. And certainly, I think from an investor perspective, still some concerns about bureaucratic hurdles and tax policies and other concerns that have been in place for quite some time. And clearly, the Indian government, up to Prime Minister Modi himself, is very aware of those perceptions. I mean, this is, I assume, one reason why every time Prime Minister Modi comes to the U.S., he meets with the top American CEOs, and that's also been the case during the
okay.
as well.
When Donald Trump came down to Gujarat right before the last elections, a massive show of strength, show of support, he got a chance to showcase his popularity abroad. What does going to election Joe Biden need out of this?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the U.S.-India relationship should be tied to elections or any type of domestic political consideration. As Rick had noted, this relationship is very much a bipartisan, multi-partisan one in both countries. I think the only issue is the fact that, indeed, both countries have elections next year. And, there is the risk that all of this momentum that we've seen in the relationship over the last few years could be interrupted if both governments are directing their attention in a big way to campaigning and elections. So I think it's important to, and I doubt that'll happen, but I think that is one concern, which is perhaps another reason why this state visit comes at the right time to underscore how important this partnership is.
Is immigration from India an issue?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a big, broad issue. I think that on the whole, if you look at that from the context of a growing diaspora community here, I mean, that's obviously a very good thing. We've seen the Indian American community has long been one of the fastest growing Asian diasporas in the United States, and that continues to happen. Certainly, when you get to issues like visas, visa policies, H-1B visas, and certainly, the well understood issue of long delays for Indians to get visas to come to the United States. This is something that U.S. officials are very aware of and are working very hard to address, recognizing that it's one of the few sticking points on the person to person or the people to people aspect of the relationship, which is a very important
Okay,
side.
but why is that happening? Because nobody here in India buys the logistics argument that we can't hire enough people. The next visa appointment available in New Delhi is March of 2024. Why is that happening?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know for sure, but my understanding is that it's just simply not enough capacity, not enough U.S. Officers, consular officers in position to do the job. But again, my sense is that this is something that that the Biden administration knows that this is a concern and it's working to address it.
Okay, in terms of real understanding, are we seeing a difference in what we saw in the first 6 months of 2023 in the balance 6 months in terms of the primacy of Europe, of Ukraine, of Russia, and focus shifting back to the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I mean, the war in Ukraine remains a top priority for the U.S., but I think more broadly, in terms of strategic outlook, the China factor and Indo-Pacific issues remain the big deal, the big focus. And I really think that the U.S. and India have worked through their differences to a considerable extent on Russia-Ukraine. I mean, you no longer have the administration pressuring India to take a stronger stand against the invasion, and I think they've recognized that there are some areas of commonalities to work through. And there's appreciation in Washington that you've had this constant messaging from New Delhi, including from the Prime Minister, about the need to de-escalate, and this is not an era of war. I think that this is not an era of war line could well come up when Prime Minister Modi addresses Congress tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think appeals for peace have already been made, and some of us are convinced that maybe India can play a proactive role there. Okay, the big elephant in the room, quite literally, or the big panda in the room is China. We have to accept, Michael, of course, that the Chinese are running the world's second largest economy. You can't wish them away. They're not going to collapse and disappear. They're going to be there. It's going to be something that all of us will have to deal with. How does that change now?
I don't actually see it as the elephant in the room anymore, because it's really become one of the dominant issues in the U.S.-India relationship from the strategic side. And even if China is not mentioned in the public messaging and the joint statements and the fact sheets, it's very much a big part of the discussions on very high levels. But look, I think that both countries have accepted the realities of China's power and how it's emerged, how it really is not rising anymore. It has risen. And this is why these are two countries that have a shared interest in not containing China, but in countering it and really trying to work together to provide alternatives. That's where you look at the importance of something like the Quad. I mean, the focus within the Quad between the U.S. and India and the other Quad members is to produce alternatives, whether it's COVID vaccines or clean energy technologies, to produce and disseminate throughout the Indo-Pacific to counter what China is doing with those same types of public goods. It's taken a while to get to that process where there's final, where things are actually being implemented, but that's clearly a goal for the two sides.
Okay, on a more practical aspect, Michael, how important is it that a major defense deal or commercial deal does get signed that generates jobs in the US, but also then means technology transfer in India? How important is it for both sides?
Well, it's very important because I would argue that technology transfers have not been. There's always been a lot of potential and a lot of talk about how that needs to happen, but it's been held back by export controls and other factors. And if this GE deal does go through, you would have an unprecedented case of a type of technology transfer that simply has never happened in U.S.-India relations, which would be important substantively but also symbolically for the relationship.
So are you suggesting that a hesitance in letting India develop its first ever jet engine perhaps is diminishing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, that's a big ticket item. Okay, I have to ask you, is the war on terror, Michael Kugalman, is it over? Because nobody seems to talk about it anymore.
Well, I think that there's dangers of being complacent, right? You've had several U.S. presidents that have sought to argue that, Al-Qaeda has been defeated, Islamic State has been defeated. We can never be complacent. I mean, for now, the good news is that indeed it appears that the risk of international terrorism has receded, but I think that certainly one has to be very concerned about the continued potency of satellites and regional factions of Islamic State, like Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan, and of course, certainly in a U.S.-India context, the threat of terrorism emanating from Pakistan, that's not something that has gone away, and I'm quite sure that that's an issue that'll be discussed, even if only briefly, by the U.S. and India, and that they both share an interest in being very concerned about that lingering threat, even though I think it's receded significantly in recent years.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the same extremely complex question which I just asked Rick. If there was any attempt by India to reintegrate part of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir at some point of stage, how would this go down internationally?
Of answering this after Rick did, so I could just say that I very much agree with what he said. This is not something that would be supported by any means by the international community. The idea of being perceived as a revisionist state, trying to establish trying to reestablish borders that maybe haven't been accepted by both sides, but have been there on a de facto basis. But indeed, I think that where India certainly continues to get a lot of sympathy from the U.S. and other countries, including in the context of Kashmir, is the issue of terrorism, the threat of terrorism. That remains very preeminent.
All right, Michael Kugalman, thanks very much for joining us and taking out your time.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.